Hey everybody, this is Chris from CSS Tricks, and I have a special guest, Kyle Simpson, with me. He's going to talk about some stuff. We're going to end up talking about CSS layout. Why are we doing this, Kyle?
Hey, Chris, it's good to be here. We haven't done a video together in a long time, and I'm super
Yeah.
excited to be back with you. A lot of people know that I spend my time trying to get to know JavaScript a little better, and I still don't really know that very well. But I definitely don't know very much about CSS. I'm just passable enough to get some black and white text pages out there. But I turned to my good buddy Chris because he does know a little bit about CSS, and I wanted to learn about CSS layout stuff. I keep trying these different things like grid and flexbox, and I
Sure.
feel like I'm stabbing in the dark. So, man, help me out. Tell me a little bit about CSS layout.
Okay, that's fun. It's a good setup too, because I'm quite sure. I guess Kyle knows a little bit about this, but we'll see. I really don't know what you know. I mean, how could I, right? And like anything, like you wouldn't expect someone to go from 0 to 100 with JavaScript. And if you watch this one video, I very much hope to teach you some things, but we're not going to go from 0 to 100 with CSS layout. I think it requires, a little time. It requires some mental model building to get you all the way up there. But I think we can do a lot of good work here. So let's do it. One thing we're going to do is look at some examples from the real world, because I think sometimes that's more helpful than looking at just raw nothing. But we do have a little raw nothing to work with as well, because sometimes that's helpful. Sometimes foo and bar is useful when you're teaching JavaScript, and sometimes it ain't.
Before we go any further, Chris, can
Yeah.
you highlight for us your little scaffolding that you've got with your HTML5 setup that I saw you do here?
Yeah.
There's a few things that you've got in those meta tags, and to be honest with you, I don't fully understand them. So could you explain?
Sure.
Because I think some of that does have some effect on what we do in CSS. So tell me about those.
Just a little bit. I mean, when I say raw nothing, I'm used to we can't just learn CSS in isolation. I mean, CSS is always paired with HTML, so we have to have that too. So I just made a folder on my desktop, opened it up in VS Code here, which again, we'll talk about another reason for that in a moment. And then I just have Emmet installed on my machine, so it has these abbreviations. So if I type div tab, I get a div. It's got one for a full HTML document too, HTML:5, and I hit tab and it gave me that. And I just gave it a title. I think the one you're probably talking about is this meta tag, which is the classic responsive design meta tag. And I wonder if we could even, while we're on the Godota site, they probably have it. Pretty much all websites in the world have this. See, here it is. That's the meta viewport tag. But let's do it in just, this is actually relevant to what we're doing. Although it's funny that we can always find an aside to go down, can't we? Head, if I kick it off, if I delete it, and then
Whoa, you just deleted an item from the live DOM view. That's actually a cool superpower of web developers.
oh, it is indeed. Oh, and it's gonna ignore that I did that. Anyway, so not a good lesson here, but usually if that meta tag is not present, maybe they have another one in here or something, it won't do the thing where it shrinks the whole, it assumes that the viewport is actually the pixel width that we think it's going to be, and it does that thing where it zooms out on the website instead.
Oh, yeah. It looks terrible, yeah.
So this is actually like a tremendously important viewport tag to have in there. And I wonder if even Chrome itself has been like, oh my God, responsive design is such a thing. And so many websites forget this meta tag that we're just going to stop.
Maybe they're going to assume initial scale or whatever.
Yeah,
that would be cool.
I don't know that to be true, but don't take my word for that, and don't assume all browsers are going to do that. You really want to, especially if you put the time into responsive design. If you're missing this one thing, you can ruin your all the effort you put into it.
So help me understand here, because I'm already learning something here. I thought that tag was only needed if you were worried about somebody using it on like a small phone. Is it also useful or doing something important if I'm dealing only with my desktop view of a page?
It's irrelevant on desktop.
Okay, so it is only mobile based.
Right,
okay.
right. I mean, we could probably prove it if we want to keep treading down this a little bit. I could put some HTML in here. How about an H1 tag that says, didn't I already have one in there? ZZZZZ. Oh, no, I didn't. But I did link up the style sheet. So H1, Chris and Kyle. And then I could scaffold out some some paragraph tags. How about 5 of them that contain lorem ipsum text? Boom!
Oh, wow.
You know, that's kind of nice. That's just Emmett at work there. Now, if I refresh, I'll have some of that stuff there. Now, if I open up the web inspector, I would think let's do an iPhone or something. It's see how it's behaving there. That's kind of what you would expect it to look like, but without the meta tag. See how dramatic that is? So this line is saying, I want the width of the document, literally like document.body, to be as wide as the device says it is. Like, please, and then don't scale it.
Please respect what the device is doing.
Please respect it. Yeah. It's still a legacy of our past when most websites weren't designed with responsive design, but hey, what are you going to do? Okay, well, that's that. That has nothing to do with CSS Grid or Flexbox, but it kind of does, because certainly we'll use those technologies in responsive design situations, you know.
And also, I think if you don't have, I certainly have had this problem before. You know, this could be a whole other video series, but like dealing with font sizes, I've had it where I've set up all these different different relative font sizes with M's and stuff, and then I didn't realize that I had some weird setting on the body, and when I fixed that, everything else was broken. So like having the context set properly matters here, I would think, to like all the decisions that you make about layout. If you don't have things zoomed or scaled properly, it's probably all gonna fail.
That's the job as a front-end developer. You need to be looking cross-browser. You need to be looking at different viewports and on different devices and stuff. You need to have a handle on that stuff, because that's literally your job. So
yeah, cool. I'm already learning stuff. Thanks, man.
Yeah, and so all this document is doing is linking up this style sheet for the most part, so that we have a playground to play in here. I also did open up the terminal and I typed git init in it, and that was at Kyle's prompting, because we have this plugin from Cadota installed that's going to give us AI-based code completion, which I'm pretty excited about trying out. I think that it's a little smarter at the moment at JavaScript stuff, which we're not going to be writing much of, if any, today, but it does do completions for CSS as well. So we're just going to kind of put it to the test and see if it gives us some helpful stuff in our kind of IntelliSense autocomplete thing, which what little I've played, it looks promising. So.
Yeah, some context for the viewers here. I am helping Cadota, who also they have Cadota and TabNine. They're both the same company. Plugins for all of your favorite editors, as you can see there. And I'm helping lead some of their developer empowerment efforts. So we're trying to get the word out about this tool. I've been playing with it myself recently, trying to figure out how it's helping me with my JavaScript coding. And I actually just put out a blog post yesterday morning about this, where I gave out some examples. So if you go to the blog on Cadota, you'll find a blog post where I gave some examples of the completions it was doing in my JavaScript. And it's impressive to me how it really does get like what I'm doing. It figures out semantically. So this experiment with Chris today is to kind of figure out like, hey, how does this work with CSS and HTML and other technologies too? Sure. We'll hopefully see a couple of interesting little suggestions. And in Chris's view, you'll see that there may be a suggestion that'll have like a percentage next to it, and that's like the engine telling us how much it's guessing, like what level of confidence it has that it thinks that's what you're wanting to do. So like the 59% there, that's the engine saying, hey, I've got this like guess that I think this is what you're trying to do. So we'll just see how it does with the CSS that Chris writes.
Yeah, sounds fun. All right, so we're a few minutes into this. What we really want to talk about is Grid, CSS Grid, relatively new layout. I guess arguably the newest layout thing in CSS. Although I'm sure super CSS nerds would be like, "What about Houdini and Paint and stuff like that?" But let's not even go there. Grid is a big deal to me. Once you've grokked it a little bit, and I like to think I have, maybe not all the way, because wow, it's a paradigm shift, as they like to say, of how layout happened, that I think my fingers, at least, they reach for Grid almost all the time when you do layout. I look at something and I'm like, how would I do this in Grid for the most part? and then it's been
So
helpful.
let me ask that question then. We're looking right now at that Cadota page,
Yeah.
and I see a series of these icons for their different editors, and I see them kind of, there's some gaps between them,
Right.
but then the second line, it looks, and I don't even know if you were to stretch the window, I don't know if it like stretches out, but I wonder to myself, is this a grid or not? Is this something that you do with grid? Oh, they have the little like Cadota and TabNine thing that shows up. That's very responsive and cool.
Yeah.
But like, is this an example where, as you were just saying, that you would reach for grid to have these things kind of flowing across lines, or is that not a grid? You know, to my untrained eye, I don't know the difference.
You don't know the difference. Okay. Yeah. There's one thing that immediately makes me think not a grid. And
okay.
Or at least, I mean, it's there's the concept of grid globally. Well, let's never use that. We're only, when I say grid, I mean CSS grid, the spec. And when you have a grid, there's 100% chance that the grid is going to be broken up in lines that travel straight up and down and lines that travel horizontally. And look at what's happening right here. That one of them slices right through the middle of this. It's just instantly not going to be particularly friendly for grid. Now there's ways around that. I could have like negative margins that yank it left across a grid line. But when I look at this, I'm like, grid isn't bringing a lot to the party. These are just some boxes that happen to wrap. And they happen to be centered too. So grid is, you know, we could make it work here, but it's not bringing us a lot of value. So probably we're going to use Flexbox, because Flexbox is another modern, extremely useful CSS layout thing that happens to have wrapping as one of the things that it can do. And centering, and it's a perfectly acceptable thing to use. But as a matter of fact, we could probably pull this off with just display inline block too. You know, there's just not a lot of value to using CSS grid here, so I probably just wouldn't.
So to clarify, if I hear what you're saying, because those cells of this grid are like offset and not perfectly lined up vertically, that's what clued you in. Like if a designer just dropped this on your desk, you're like, oh, that's probably, grid's probably not the right tool for that. So in my mind, the thing that I was wondering, and I'm glad we're talking about this, I was wondering is, because I'm super old school, right? Like I actually kind of skipped a bit over Flexbox. I knew only little bits and pieces, and now I'm trying to pick up grid. But what I used to do was the old table-based layout, which I know is like heresy when we're talking about CSS these days.
Sure.
But I remember in the table days, whether it was the CSS table version or whether it was literally the markup table version, I remember these things like call span, where you could like make a thing span multiple columns and like fake these kinds of overlaps. So is that still a thing in grid, or is that kind of been abandoned? Is that like too like archaic?
No, I'd say call span is a if you remember that and remember reaching for that, there's a pretty one-to-one match for that in grid, because in grid, which we'll get to, we haven't talked about it all yet, but you end up setting up these grid lines and placing things on those grid lines. And when you place something on it, you kind of pick how many rows wide is it? Where does the XY coordinate kind of start for it? How many columns wide? How many rows tall? That's like call span and row span, I guess, at work. But they are very different. I mean, tables, the only reason they're heresy or whatever today is because the accessibility is so bad for them. They get announced as a table, and you're like, what? Why? Isn't this just some layout? And usually when things get announced as a table, you're like, oh, there must be data in here that it needs to be cross-referenced based on the row and the column that it's in. And if it's just being used for layout, that's not what's happening. It causes confusion. Just kind of a bad idea for layout. And frankly, we don't have to reach for tables anymore, at least in, web design.
For most of it.
Right. So just real quick with the Flexbox thing, we're talking about display values. So you might be useful to display block, display inline block. That's where Flexbox and grid come in. Oh, look at that. There's
You've typed out Flex, and they are 97% sure that you meant what you said.
Yeah, and only 49 if I miss the X there. That's fun. So let's put let's put no content in there. Who cares? And then I'll just say that the Flex children have this specific width, which they kind of do here. So what is it? Like 80, 99. Let's make them 99 pixels wide. Why not?
Awesome.
And let's give them a height because they have no content. Otherwise they would collapse, and there'd be nothing in there. So let's give it a height of a little bit more than that, 150 pixels or something. Background red driven development, of course. And we'll see in our new layout then, hopefully, if I save the files correctly. Flex children are I've already failed us. How many popped up?
Oh no. Live demos.
Yeah, but there's nothing difficult happening here. So it's not, the CSS isn't applying.
Oh, it's flex child versus flex children. You did flex child in the markup, and there you go.
Thank you, flex child. So they're all right next to each other. That's a little weird. We could space them out. This is a little bit modern, as I could say that the gap between them is 1 rem or something, and that will kind of push them away from each other. That's very helpful in the world of Flex. That's relatively new. You were able to do that when Flexbox just dropped, but that's kind of nice. Now they're gonna. It just so happens that they fit, right? Nice, but there might be a moment in which they stop fitting in. In fact, it's ignoring my 99 pixels. Like, that's not 99 pixels. It's being rude to my pixels. I could say flex wrap, and that will start respecting them and pushing them down, kind of nice. Now, that's not what's happening on theirs. Remember, theirs kind of center the last two. That's not particularly difficult. I think justify content. What is it, center? Oh, look at it, it's helping, because I don't remember. Is it justify content middle?
There you go.
Is it justify content? Oh, it's center. That was actually.
Yeah, you could, Oda. That was helpful.
Quite helpful. Oh, and then because there's 2, they happen to line up. Let's kill one of them. Will the one go in the middle? Yeah, see.
There we go.
Now it's
overlap.
Yeah, that's what grid would be difficult to make happen there. So that's nice, and this is perfectly fine code. Now with it ignoring my 99 pixels, that was kind of an interesting moment. So let's dig there just for a sec. Rather than using width, you can use flex basis to make 99 pixels. Now this is, we're getting a little bit into the weeds here. It's still ignoring me, but that's because it's willing to shrink these elements. That's just the nature of Flexbox. Flexbox is very much about the children of the layout and less about the parent. So you're telling the children how you want the children to behave in Flexbox. And there's flex grow and there's flex shrink. And it's kind of, these are values saying, are you willing to do this or not? And let's say they're not willing to grow and they're not willing to shrink, which is kind of like almost like saying false in JavaScript. If you do that, oh my gosh, how did I mess this up? Let's do flex 0, 0. I'll use the shorthand there because I'm a little more familiar with that. Is it still going to? Yeah, that's kind of the shorthand saying, I am not willing to grow and I am not willing to flex. Please leave me be at 99 pixels, which causes this horizontal scroll bar because we have said it's not okay to wrap. Do not wrap. Okay. You have to ask for it to wrap. So just a kind of that was just a little aside. Yeah.
Now, you were setting the CSS width of these individual divs with this flex kind of way of doing the width. But what if the content in one of those, like what if these were, buttons or images or something where it had its own inherent width inside of that? Would it still have been trying to shrink it down, or would it have respected the content width inside of the children?
Yeah, that's an interesting situation, right? I'm glad you brought that up too, because sometimes when you're playing with layout like this in a kind of unrealistic scenario, there is no content in here. It behaves differently because there's this thing in web design called, inherent size to things, which is like, it matters. The content matters. Like, let's say this one has an image inside of it and the width of that image is, 500 pixels wide. We'll just use, we'd have to use, what is this, 1990? We have to use inline style.
An inline style tag. Oh my god.
Well, that's a little more. Yeah, I don't forget it. 500 pixels wide, or this one has lorem ipsum text inside of it, or something. That is meaningful. That can push things. When one's really nasty is one like this. Pre-formatted text, where you're writing like, var foot equals big or something.
I always write var foot. You and I are on the same page here. I always write var foot.
Oh, look at how bizarre that got. And there's things stretching out, and it's smashing content together. Oh my gosh, what a mess. Now it's trying to respect that width because, oh my gosh, what a mess. And this is the space that happens because I indented.
You did tabs.
See that? It's that space right there in the HTML itself that's being rendered here, because pre says honor all spaces that you find inside of it.
Unlike regular HTML, which shrinks all the concurrent white space.
Absolutely, and it was even respecting the return from here to here when it was a pre tag. Yeah, it's just crazy stuff, and that makes the inherent width of this very strange. Okay, well, I've led us down a weird alley here, but look at how this one is wider than these ones are. In Flexbox, it was like, I have no choice but to stretch this out. I think we can battle that by giving it a min width of 0. I hope. I did not prepare for any of this. I'm sorry. But that's kind of saying, usually, now this is an important concept in both Flexbox and Grid, and I have some actually strong opinions about this. Min width is implied that it's min content, is this keyword value in CSS that you almost never see because it's just implied. And it means
what is that?
It's just saying that I'm not willing to be any smaller than the content like dictates inside of me, so, which is a weird value for min width. I think a mental model is like, I don't know, the min width is 0. It's like you haven't told it what a min width is. It should be able to shrink as small as it can go. But
I guess my mental model would have been that min width, like if you didn't set min width, then my mental model would have been that it's equal to whatever you set the width equal to.
Yeah, sure. In this case, it doesn't have a width. It only has a flex basis because we're in this very weird context. But this is very useful to us here. So if you've ever had a situation where some content inside one of your flex items or grid items, as we'll get to, is messing with the size of the column or whatever you're trying to set up, remember this little trick. This min width 0 is going to help you kind of restore balance to your columns, because this is, even though this is breaking out and it feels weird, it's probably what you want. You probably want your layout to have integrity and not be like having columns get all messed up on you just because you happen to throw a pre tag into one of them.